I think we'll make a start now as the numbers are stabilizing of those joining. So welcome to everyone for the third of these Clark lectures by Rita Felsky. Welcome back, Rita. Just a couple of housekeeping things. One is to say that Rita's first two lectures can be watched on YouTube, have been recorded and can be watched on YouTube. You can find the link on the Trinity College website. I think you go to the tab that says About at the top that lists current or forthcoming events. You go to Rita's lectures, the flyer for her lectures, and you will see that there are links to her first two lectures there. The second thing to say is that Rita welcomes questions. There will be time for Q&A afterwards, as there have been for the first two lectures. If you do wish to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A box that you will see at the bottom of your screen. You don't need to wait until Rita's finished her lecture. You can ask questions in writing and we'll pick them up, or as many as we can of them when Rita's finished. The third thing to say is by way of warning that Rita and I have been online for a few minutes now, and I'm not trying to blame it all on her, of course, but the connection at her end does seem a little uncertain this week for the first time, which is slightly worrying. So we will persevere. If it happens that we freeze, we lose connection once or twice briefly, then we can probably live with that. If it turns into a more permanent and depressing problem, then we'll take other steps. So that's by way of preamble. I would love to say to Rita, the floor is all yours, but instead I have to say the screen is all yours, Rita.
Thank you so much. And I think we're discussing that if I freeze and disappear and I don't come back, we will record the lecture and then make it available on YouTube. So it won't be completely lost. Again, apologies for my internet, which is usually very well behaved, but for some reason started messing up 5 minutes ago, just to make things more exciting. So today, Robert Walser. It's almost 40 years since I last read Robert Walser, in a country 10,000 miles from where I now live. After 3 years adrift at Cambridge, I had decided almost on a whim to enroll for a PhD on the far side of the world. Housed in a slab-like humanities building towering over the outskirts of Melbourne, I found myself marveling at the vastness of the sky and the intensity of an intellectual milieu that formed around émigré Hungarian philosophers who'd studied with Lukács. This is Agnes Helen Ferencz-Feher, who I mentioned in my first lecture. What my dissertation would be about was far from certain, but I knew from the start that I would write on Walser. What haphazard trail of footnotes or passing remarks had brought me to the author of Jacob von Gunten, I no longer recall. Walser was, in the early 80s, very much the writer's writer, barely known in the English-speaking world. Even now, when the admiration of Benjamin and Kafka and Sontag is echoed by Coetzee and Sebald and Agamben, he remains half in the shadows. Yet I felt addressed in some obscure way by Walser's work. Engaging it felt like an obligation not to be shirked. And a slight chill went over me when I learned only actually very recently that we not only share the same birthday, April the 15th, but that Walser died the year I was born. It's kind of pretty uncanny, I think. Anyway, what the obligation involved seemed impossible to clarify, either to myself or to my advisor, who scrawled irritated queries and acerbic remarks on each of my dissertation chapters. After a year and a half of floundering, I abandoned my idea for dissertation and went in another direction entirely. Let me start my PowerPoint now, and perhaps I'll be of some solace to any PhD students who are currently listening, who are struggling with a dissertation topic. I'm here to reassure you that it's actually extremely common, and it was certainly my experience. Circling back to Walser 4 decades later, I wonder whether I can fail better, edge a little closer to what stymied me. When reading Jacob von Gunten, for example, I don't know my way about. Is it that the usual signposts are absent, their markings illegible, or do they point in different directions? The remarks of his best readers offer a guiding thread, often echoing his own words. The eye of Walser's prose is of someone drowning in obedience, Susan Sontag. We see in Walser, according to Christopher Middleton, an embrace of the delicate art of ineptitude. And Siebold describes him as a clairvoyant of the small. In a kind of very interesting essay where she surveys the 3 distinct waves of Walser's reception, Johann Schmidt notes a rising appreciation of the topicality and timeliness of his work. You know, the amount of translations and commentary has gone up drastically to the last decade. Is there a correlation, she asks, between Walser's chronicles of the humble and insignificant and a turn to less heroic forms of interpretation, between its avoidance of depth and a declining interest in styles of reading that draw out concealed or repressed meanings? Meanwhile, the pathos of Walser's life as the quintessential outsider writer is never very far from view. His departure from school at the age of 14, the periods working as a clerk, a butler, and in other modest occupations, a lack of possessions or permanent home, a stalled literary career combined with an almost manic level of productivity, evidenced in these microscripts, copious writings penciled in a minute, almost indecipherable script that came to light after his death. Almost 30 years as a patient in mental institutions. Regular hikes through the Swiss countryside with his friend and walking partner, Carl Selig, that are commemorated in an important book, and the discovery of his body lying in the snow by school children on Christmas Day. It's impossible to disentangle what belongs to a work, properly speaking, from its creation and reception, Latour remarks, and the trajectory of Walser's writing cannot be excised, I think, from the long shadow cast by the biography. So this is quite an interesting novel, Bartleby and Co., by the Spanish novelist Enrique Villamatas. And here the novelist includes Walser among a cohort of writers, both real and imaginary, whom he describes as, quote, artists of refusal. So Walser's outsider status, embodied in both the literature and the life, embodies in this light as a surreptitious mutiny, the I prefer not to of the underdog. Yet it's not entirely certain to what extent Walser's work supports such a reading. His characters extol the delights of yielding, renouncing, giving way. They yearn to be lowly and subordinate, to be nothings and nobodies. How fortunate I am, chirps the hero of Jacob von Gunten, not to be able to see myself in anything worth respecting and watching, to be small and to stay small. I can only breathe in the lower regions. What could be more blasphemous to the modern sensibility than the desire of Walser's characters to stay small, more baffling than their eagerness to submit? Stressing the kind of ironic or the covertly insurrectionary aspects of Walser's work, critics strive to render it more palatable to modern sensibilities. But perhaps we should take such statements at their word. And meanwhile, Walser's writing lacks the bleakness of vision that characterizes his contemporaries, such as Kafka, for example. His characters have all been healed, wrote Walter Benjamin. Their work is not the nervous tension of decadence, but the pure and lively atmosphere of convalescence. So when you read Walser's writing, you find that one diminutive or saccharine adjective is piled remorselessly on top of another. The countryside is always beautiful. The cottage is snug. The weather magnificent. The sun lovely. The girl dainty. The brook sparkling. The guest house homey. It's not that Walser's work is devoid of somber accents, but that they're often sweetened and lightened, as when he writes, quote, of the delightfully dreamy melancholia, the enchanting hopelessness, the heavenly beautiful dejection, genial sorrow, sweet cruelty. Walser's insouciant affirmations are not just hollow, I think, a mask for suppressed anguish, but a defining aspect of his art. Now, to be sure, the kind of eccentricity of his style, the digressions, non sequiturs, the manic loquaciousness and serpentine syntax are likely to inspire hesitation as to whether naivete or irony are in play. The garrulousness of his characters would seem to conflict with their impulse to self-denial. After all, if they yearn to remain invisible and unnoticed, why do they say so much about so little? What defines Kafka's work, according to Adorno, is a contrast between its stylistic sobriety and its highly imaginary happenings. But in Walser, we see the reverse. A fusion and exaggeration are often yoked to the most trivial items and events. His sketches cobble together the most banal observations. We're told that ladies' shoes may be brown or black, that winter brings sledding, an activity that's pleasant to many, that a piece of roast pork is an honest meal and bread as nutritious as it is delicious. Are these words to be read in the manner of Flaubert's Bouvard and Pécuchet as a mordant taxonomy of truisms? Or are they offered up in a spirit of sincere delight? The tone of Walser's work is often opaque. How to pass its blend of exuberance and submission, of lyrical abandon and self-denial. This is where I come to talking about shining and disclosure. Might the language of disclosure offer a way into Walser's work? To hazard such a word is to be made conscious of the walls between intellectual fields, how ideas can acquire vigor and momentum in one domain while being unvoiced in others. That art can disclose an otherwise unknowable reality is a commonplace of European philosophy, a staple of hermeneutics, broached in Romanticism, a keystone of Heidegger's thought invoked by Gadamer, Habermas, and Taylor. The import of literature lies in its world-disclosing capacity. Rather than either representing, say, or estranging, it creates new realities. And yet, while various aspects of European thought are taken up in Anglo-American literary studies, the language of disclosure doesn't have much currency. It crops up occasionally among critics who are influenced by Levinas or Derrida, who see literature as about the disclosure of otherness. And a handful of scholars have explicitly rallied to its defense. So Robert Eagleston, for example, draws on Heidegger to argue, quote, the artworks in the broadest sense disclose or give us the world in which we live. Yet overall, the idea of disclosure, gets really not very much attention, I think, from literary critics. As I say, as opposed to a lot of attention it's getting from philosophers and political theorists. So let's turn to philosopher Charles Taylor, who discusses disclosure and says, to disclose is to make something manifest in a way that exceeds the form of the propositional statement. Many uses of language, he says, have nothing to do with information. This is the quote here. We also establish intimacy and distance, open contact and close it off, cry for and give or withhold sympathy, disclose the beauty of the world or the depth of our feelings or the virtues of the good life or the nature and demands of God or the gods. So to try and clarify what he means by this term disclosure, he sets up a contrast category, if you like, and that is assertion. So says Taylor, when a cook yells, "Soup's on!" to a group of people who are standing outside, something is being asserted, but nothing is being disclosed. The shout is just an act of information giving, a use of language to coordinate actions, get people to come in, and get their soup. But when Taylor is listening to Chopin, he says, he's drawn to an undefinable yearning. A human possibility is articulated and disclosed here, but nothing is asserted. So something's being conveyed by the music. It can't be boiled down, though, to a statement or a proposition. The language of disclosure, in this sense, has nothing to do with problem solving, says Taylor, but partakes of aesthetics and metaphysics and theology. Now, obviously, Taylor points this out, in many forms of communication, both aspects are in play. So you have a novel like War and Peace, it discloses, but it also asserts. So Tolstoy's creating a richly imagined literary world, but he's also drawn into sermonizing, asserting to his readers. Conversely, the impact of a non-literary form like philosophy derives not only from its command of logic or argument, but its disclosive force. A reader's touched by a tone of voice, a striking metaphor, is there a felt affinity with a style or sensibility. So disclosure is not restricted to art, but it does point to the imaginative, creative uses of language. And to be open to disclosure would seem to require a stance that's receptive rather than critical or diagnostic or grasping. So how might we translate this, into the concerns of literary studies? Well, unlike philosophers, I think, literary critics are not for the most part preoccupied with the status of, propositions and assertions. So I'd argue that, the relevant contrast case would be something rather different. And I'd like to suggest defamiliarization. So, this language of defamiliarizing, which is coined, by the Russian formalists at the early part of the 20th century, soon swells into a core concept of, of literary criticism, of theory, of poetics, hailed as a key to the literariness of literature. Through its formal devices, it's argued, literature manifests its distance from the mundane hum of everyday speech. It makes the world newly strange. So the formalists saw defamiliarization as a means of renewing perception. So that's a renewal that's also associated with disclosure. So that an interesting question is, why is one of these words, defamiliarizing, so essential to literary studies and the other more rarely spoken? I'd suggest it's because defamiliarizing is a word stripped of enchantment, voided of otherworldly qualities. It sees literariness as a matter of formal techniques that can be passed with analytical precision. One ambition of the formalists, of course, was to put the study of literature on a kind of scientific or quasi-scientific footing. Now, when Shklovsky asserts, in a famous quote, that art exists, quote, that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. There, he's certainly gesturing towards felt experience, towards the emotional and the tactile. And yet when the idea of defamiliarizing was seized on and developed by literary scholars, it was often fed through machinery of semiotics equated with cognitive distancing and critical detachment. And it was also, of course, yoked to politics via the important influence of Brecht. His insistence that techniques of aesthetic alienation, what he called, Verfremdung, the V effect, would bring audiences to realize their political and economic alienation in a sense of Entfremdung. So here I'm setting up perhaps a rather too simple binary, but I think it's helpful to at least draw out the distinction I'm trying to make. So on the left here, you see the map of defamiliarization and the kind of language that's often associated with it as I've just described it. Disclosure, though, suggests revelation. Its synonyms are of a different kind: attestation, unveiling, unconcealment, poetic illumination. So if defamiliarizing is associated with a negative stance, a DE, right? Disclosure slants towards the affirmative. The stress is not on subtracting, making something less familiar, but on bringing something into view. And while defamiliarizing is often harnessed to the aims of political or philosophical critique, disclosure seems to gesture beyond the horizon of reason. In the tradition of philosophical hermeneutics, it often radiates religious or redemptive overtones. Heidegger, of course, speaks of disclosure as the coming into being, the happening of truth, as in his famous reading of Van Gogh's Shoes. And along similar lines, Herbert Dreyfus and Sean Kelly, Dreyfus is as a well-known commentator on Heidegger, write that the job of a work of art is to disclose a world, give meaning, and create truth. In that sense, works of art working can be thought of as sacred. Now, I think it'd be hard to imagine a sentiment that's less palatable to the hard-nosed and resolutely secular stance of most literary critics. What I want to do, though, is take up the language of disclosure to consider not what literature represents, but what it presents. Walser's work is alien to the literary conventions of realism. In his prose, as one critic puts it, Established reality is flushed away. And yet it's also an uneasy fit with our usual picture of modernism. You know, the bohemians gathered in fashionable cafes and salons who mixed artistic experiments with disdain for bourgeois values. An awkward figure from the Swiss provinces who was ill at ease in the avant-garde coteries of Berlin, Walser remained, as Mark Hammond puts it, a reluctant modern. So in my view, there's something a bit strained about current attempts to retrieve a hidden radicalism in Walser's writing that chimes with current concerns. Meanwhile, James Coetzee's claim that Jacob von Gunten depicts a petty bourgeois mentality that would be drawn to the brown shirts seems like a surprising misstep for a normally very subtle critic. Perhaps we can come at things in another way. What Walser offers, says his translator Christopher Middleton, is a luminous naivete that has lost none of its strangeness, that offers a bridge of light to the real. His writings, according to the German critic Martin Walser, are studied with patches of bright darkness, like the paintings of Rembrandt. And Jan Plug remarks that Walser's figures carry faint lanterns of hope that shed light onto the night. I think it's striking that Walser's critics are often, they often reach for images of illumination in a way that would seem to confirm the aptness of the language of disclosure. For Heidegger, the work of art brings something forth, allowing it to shine in a certain way. Drawing on his ideas, Dreyfus and Kelly propose that while the very idea of shining might seem imperiled in a disenchanted modernity, shining things can still be found in the recesses of daily life, hidden in plain sight. Is something similar at stake, perhaps, in the writings of Walser, such that the estranging aspects of his work coexist with moments of enchanted shimmering? Disclosure, says Martin Zeel, is like learning a new language for things not yet known. So let me say a bit now about my concept disclosure. So my interest in this idea actually was triggered not, say, by Heidegger, but by Nicholas Compridis' book, Critique and Disclosure. So Compridis is an Australian and Canada-based political theorist, and he belongs to this kind of international cohort of thinkers who have an ongoing, if ambivalent, relationship to the Frankfurt School. And the point of his book, the fact that it has these two terms, critique and disclosure, is precisely to say that critique alone is insufficient. Only when combined with a more affirmative concept of disclosure can it inspire genuine renewal and transformation. So according to Compridis, theory nowadays is hobbled by being overly rationalistic and defensive, skeptical and self-qualifying, drained of utopian energies, inspiring visions of the future. What could be more vital, he asks, than a critical theory that can disclose alternative possibilities that might make the world anew? And so here, disclosure is both a matter of creativity as well as receptivity, new forms of thought, as well as an openness to such thought, a willingness to be generous as well as suspicious. And if you're here for my first lecture, you'll see how obviously this links to, the themes I outlined in that first lecture, the sort of turn to a more affirmative vocabulary in recent Frankfurt School thought. Now, much of this book, Critique and Disclosure, is a reckoning with Habermas's philosophical discourse of modernity, which, as many of you know, is Habermas's quarrel with post-structuralism and his predecessors. So in his account of, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Bataille, Foucault, Derrida, and others, Habermas is, rallying in defense of a modernity that he feels is unjustly maligned. All these aesthetic critiques of modernity, he contends, they are striving to unmask reason as nothing more than a will to power. All systems are placed under relentless suspicion. Modernity is condemned as a never-ending spiral of catastrophe. Habermas insists, though, that reason is not just instrumental, right, as many of these thinkers would argue, but also communicative. It's not just a tool of domination and manipulation. It's also how we learn new things, reassess our beliefs, and arrive at a better understanding, if never a perfect one. So, the critique of reason goes astray in mistaking the problem of reason with a whole. Foucault and Derrida, he points out, get caught up in performative contradictions. They rely on norms to articulate their own denunciation of norms, remain entangled within the very discourse of reason they place under suspicion. Okay, so what? But, what on earth does it have to do with disclosure? Well, according to Habermas, this lineage of post-Nietzschean thought, that then ends with people like Foucault and Derrida and other French theorists, is founded on what he calls the luminous force of world-disclosing language. So in other words, he sees the concept of disclosure as a way of understanding this lineage of, as he sees it, anti-rationalist theory from Adorno and Horkheimer and Nietzsche through to contemporary French theory. So according to Habermas, the repudiation of reason inspires a collective hurtling towards the realm of the aesthetic, seen as seething with fractious energies, embodying excess, intoxication, the limit experience. In a grey, administered world, the aesthetic is hailed as the only remaining source of authenticity. Theorists seek a fatalistic or ecstatic refuge in the other of reason. And so here Habermas wants to take post-structuralism to task for spurning the everyday use of words in favor of a kind of avant-garde aesthetic of self-shattering that he says is accessible only to initiates. So the point I'm trying to make here, is that Habermas, in this argument, he specifically yokes, for example, Foucault and Derrida to the language of disclosure, right, rather than, for example, to the language of defamiliarization. And in doing so, he downplays the kind of critical aspects of their work. And through the language of disclosure, rather, he cements their ties to a Heideggerian legacy that's often been treated with strong suspicion, if not outright hostility, by the Frankfurt School. So post-structuralism, in other words, is shoved into the orbit of what Habermas portrays as a romantic, regressive tradition of thought. The point of the book, in a sense, I think, and I'm not unsympathetic to it, but I do think it misrecognizes some of the theorists it discusses. And anyway, the point of the book, I think, is to show that the so-called postmodern is, for Habermas, the anti-modern. Now, I'm only coming at Habermas indirectly because, the merits or flaws of this account are not Compridis' main concern. Rather, what Compridis wants to do in his book is to wrest this idea of disclosure away from its portrayal by Habermas as kind of negative, reactionary, anti-modern, in order to redeem it as a vital concept for critical theory. So, Compridis says disclosure is not the opposite of critique, the kind of bad other, as Habermas suggests. It's an essential companion and complement to it. A one-sided fixation on the problem-solving functions of language overlooks the importance of the aesthetic, right? Imagination and creativity in political life. And, disclosure is not just quarantined in avant-garde art. It's also part of the everyday world, how alternative realities are revealed. We come to see the world anew. And here Compridis, I think, is getting at something rather similar to Richard Rorty. Rorty is well known for making the claim that social change actually is not, for the most part, brought about by critical arguments. Rather, it's brought about by bold and visionary redescriptions of reality that create new vocabularies. So here's this kind of little debate between Habermas and Compridis about the merits of disclosure. And so, I'm very much in sympathy with Compridis' intervention here, because I think it's increasingly recognized that critical theory has overlooked the importance of emotion and imagination in political life. Yet my concerns today are a little bit aslant of his own. I certainly think disclosure can be combined with critique, but today I want to think about what disclosure suggests about the limits of critique, about what evades its purview. And it's here that I'm turning to Walser, because I think in Walser's work, ordinary things dig in their heels. They refuse to be slotted into larger frameworks of explanation or emancipation. They're revealed as deserving of attention in themselves, rather in terms of a larger purpose. They radiate an ordinary yet enigmatic enchantment. Now, this does not mean, and here again, I think I'm on Compridis' side, that the language of disclosure implies some kind of, full-throated surrender to the irrational. The point is rather that either the presence or the absence of reason cannot serve as the sole criterion or measure of value. The disclosive force of aesthetic experience can't be subsumed within the language of emancipation or equality or even subversion. Something fundamental is lost if art's value is defined only in terms of its potential to advance political ends. So to my mind, disclosure is a word that's really well suited for encounters with certain kinds of literary works, those whose enigmatic qualities elude our usual ways of imputing meaning. So here again, to make a link back to my first lecture, you remember the point of the first lecture was to say that I reject the idea that one concept can define the many different things that literature does. So I actually don't think disclosure is that helpful for talking about literature and art as such. I think it's helpful for talking about Walser. In the same way as recognition is crucial, I think, for a highly political text, such as Eribon that I discussed last time. So I think disclosure is a suitable and highly apt term for Walser. And I think perhaps this same sentiment is echoed by Middleton, again, the translator of Walser, when he says, Walser does not bring intellect or ideas, but a new world of sensibility, an image of reality seen without the interference of a concept. Now, deconstructed critics are often drawn to Walser's work for this reason, because they find in him a welcome ally for their critique of logocentrism. And yet they have much less to say about the sheer ordinariness of much of the content of Walser's writing. The delights of a tram ride, a kitten playing with wood shavings, the modest industriousness of a button. In Walser's writing, obscurity arises not from a striving for difficulty, but from the utmost simplicity. And here again, I think some of the online reviews hit the mark. Goodreads again. I was wholly unprepared, writes a reviewer, at how Jacob von Gunten broke me down and hollowed me out. It's at times so shockingly beautiful, I was, despite myself, moved to tears. The dude writes like an angel, with pure charm and with a scrambled semantics nonetheless crystal clear, which must be the emblem only of seraphim. So I think this is a fabulous quotation because, you know, the mention of scrambled semantics points indeed to the literary critical motif of linguistic estrangement, which is certainly there. And yet angels and seraphim conjure up a rather different register of enchantment and divine messengers, which I think is equally important. So I'm going to turn now to look at Walser more closely, and particularly underdogs, ashes, ash, and buttons. Much has been written about Walser's negative relation to literary convention. His preferred form is the sketch, the snippet, the fragment. In the novel's plot and character have only a token and ghostly presence. Events aren't ordered according to chains of causality. They emerge out of nowhere. Random swerves and free associations replace the logic of explanation. His transitions are as abrupt as table edges, writes William Gass. Non sequiturs flock his pages like starlings to the evening trees. Stripped of interiority, his characters do not invite empathy and are opaque to the delicate probes of psychological assessment. In his short essay on Walser, Benjamin describes them as laceratingly, inhumanly, and unfailingly superficial. Jacob von Gunten is, I think, often seen as the most important work of Walser's. It's one that, certainly the one I was first drawn to, and it's often referred to as an anti-Bildungsroman. You know, the protagonist is a student at the Institut Benjamenta, but there's only one lesson that's repeated over and over again. And it seems that the teachers are asleep, or they're dead, or they're seemingly dead, or they're fossilized. He learns nothing and wants to become nothing. In later life, I shall become a charming, utterly spherical zero, he says. He and his fellow pupils long to be small, yearn to be drilled and disciplined. It's hard to imagine a scenario more alien to Kant's view of modernity as humanity's release from self-incurred tutelage. I'd like to be scolded, told off, condemned and sentenced. That would do no end of good. When critics speak in a striking phrase of Walser's unrelenting style, unrelenting, it's artless, or is it artful clumsiness, unmotivated observations, naive effusions? Words collide, contradict themselves, pile up into unsteady heaps, trail off into inconsequence. Their effects are unpredictable. Some of Walser's work sear themselves permanently in the mind. Others can lapse into a wooden whimsy, failed humor, or a Heimat-style folksiness that, if it were attributed to another author, would be summarily dismissed as kitsch. It's very striking, I think, that Walser's work is treated with an uncommon gentleness and tact by critics. So, negative judgments of his work are pretty much unheard of. The spirit of both the writing and the life is crystallized in the idea of rambling. Hikes through Swiss forests and villages with Carl Sager, with occasional stops for veal with mushroom sauce or raisin bread with plum butter, are echoed in a writing that deviates and digresses, drifting along in haphazard fashion, crammed with irrelevances and non sequiturs. Middleton writes of a type of sentence that starts, halts, turns a corner, almost dances backwards, then quite suddenly has arrived. And certainly Walser's critics, I think, are very sharply attuned to the peculiarities of his syntax and style. And I think that perhaps again confirms, the hold of the defamiliarization paradigm, because it seems so crucial to decipher literary techniques as being the key to this process of estrangement. There are, of course, also essential parallels between how Walser writes and what he writes about. Johann Gormsen-Schmidt says, at a thematic level, nothing is too small or trivial to be poeticized, just as on a formal level, the sentences are not subordinate to each other. So the avoidance of hierarchies of language is accompanied by a strenuous attention to the humble and overlooked. Individual sketches center on getting a haircut, overcoats, porcelain figurines, toothache, a swallow, being given a tip, a stroll, the experience of knocking. In being scattered among these micro observations, stories that have more weighty titles, The Philosopher, The Murderess, Jesus, Essay on Bismarck, are brought down to the same disarmingly modest level. And so when the commentary on Walser pitches itself at a too rarefied altitude, as I think it sometimes does, speaking only of theological resonance, the irony of representation, the mise en abîme of language, it would seem to reproduce the disdain for the commonplace that Walser's work is furiously struggling against. We don't need to see anything out of the ordinary, Walser writes at the end of a little ramble. We already see so much. Meanwhile, his sketch of a philosopher, a figure described as trapped in his own thought while life flies past, concludes. A pity that his long reflections made him lose so many things. What things then should we try not to lose? What are Walser's texts about? Well, I'm just going to focus on, obviously there could be many answers, I'm just going to focus on two. The desire to submit and become small, and the identification with things, obviously related. Let's think about the first then, the desire to submit. So nowadays, says Stephen Conner in his interesting book, Giving Way, we lack an adequate language for making sense of submission, at least in a non-sexual sense. Zachar Massock remains endlessly fascinating. The books and articles on masochism continue to pile up. But other expressions of a desire to submit are rarely taken at face value. Either they're treated skeptically as just being pure hypocrisy, or else they're celebrated for a cunningly concealed spirit of revolt, in other words, flipped into their opposite. And yet for much of human history, life was organized around the moral value and meaningfulness of service to a higher, often a religious ideal. The very word humiliation, Conner observes, has lost the positive meanings it held until the 17th century. Humiliation as a process of self-humbling, right? A positive self-abasement before God. Whereas nowadays it's seen as meaning a violation, an unwilling experience of being shamed or shunned by others. It seems inconceivable, at least outside of a dominatrix's dungeon, that anyone would want to be humiliated. And it's here, I think, that Walser's work cuts across the historical grain, reminding us, to quote Benjamin, of the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, or Latour, that the past is not surpassed, but revisited, reshuffled. We're less modern than we take ourselves to be, divided not from the past by a brick wall, but a flimsy and threadbare curtain. When self-determination is seen as a fundamental human right, and when people are thought to possess a natural desire for freedom, a desire to submit can only seem shameful, archaic, pre-modern. And yet the last century offers countless examples of the willingness to fall into line, to duck down, to give way. To be well and truly regimented and harassed, that is the highest of honors for us, says Jakob. We don't rebel either. It would never cross our minds. We have collectively so few thoughts. I despise my capacity for thinking. So why this desire to not think and not act? Of course, paradoxically, because it's thinking in the very attempt to not think. Well, perhaps because the idea and the ideal of freedom is double-sided, right? It's not an unconditional good. It demands self-determination, of course, calling on us to decide for ourselves who we are, to actualize our interests and desires. To be freed from external constraints is thus to be made responsible for the shape of one's own life, liable, therefore, for one's own mistakes and missteps. And such demands can be felt as burdensome rather than liberating, triggering anxiety, paralysis, or self-doubt. And here there's kind of, I guess, some interesting analogies to Frankfurt School thought. So, Erich Fromm, in his Escape from Freedom, reflects on the psychological appeal of submitting to a higher power. Because the person who submits then is saved from making decisions, from the final responsibility for the fate of themselves, and is therefore saved from the doubt of what decision to make. And one sees similar themes in early Frankfurt School thought, Adorno and Horkheimer, analyzing the authoritarian personality, whatever. What's interesting about Walser, though, is that he slices across the kind of distancing gaze of such studies, right? Their critical diagnoses of immaturity and pathology. Instead, we come to experience up close the allure of things, the desire to be a nothing. And it's interesting that Walser has an essay on freedom where he foreshadows actually many of Fromm's arguments. Freedom, he laments, it's definitely lamenting tone, sets out to be single, tolerates no other freedoms beside itself. We're always supposed to be bowing inwardly to the pure image of freedom, right? Obviously, again, a kind of paradox. Freedom demands that we subordinate ourselves to freedom. He owns up to feeling thoroughly oppressed by the commandment to be free. And in this sense, taking on the role of a servant provides a respite from the anxieties of achievement, the need for constant anticipation of the future. Meanwhile, abasing oneself can be a means of raising oneself, lowliness as a sign of holiness. That humility can tip over into pridefulness is known in many forms of religious practice. More discerning on this score than theories of power that, looking too literally, see submission as nothing more than subjection. The seemingly powerless can draw sustenance from their humble station. Jakob remarks, for example, if there were no commandments, no duties in the world, I would die, starve, be crippled by boredom. I only have to be spurred on, compelled, regimented. Ultimately, it's I who decides, only I. So there's a kind of willful pursuit of self-abasement, a desire to become a zero that puts Walser's heroes in the company of mystics, ascetics, and penitents, modern descendants of the holy fools who feigned madness while preaching humility and love of the lowly. So Elias Canetti, for example, refers to Walser as a martyr and a peculiar saint. So what's interesting, though, is even as his writings preach deference and sing hymns to obedience, they are voided of the ideals that once justified and indeed sometimes dignified, right? The idea of service. God is no longer in evidence. Nobles no longer possess the slightest shred of nobility. Earthly authorities are disinvested of all symbolic or moral power. In Jakob von Gunten, as we've seen, the teachers are decrepit or dead. Meanwhile, the protagonist of the assistant works without pay for an engineer whose inventions are spectacular flops. As Agamben points out, Walser's world is entirely profane, without the hope of either perdition or salvation. And yet the choreography of submission remains irresistible, even as it's emptied of charismatic authority. It persists as an empty yet seductive shell, a carapace without a content. The master remains essential, even though he's been unmasked. At one point, Jakob dreams of fighting in a future war. I'd only be a little cog in the machine of a great design. Soldierly discipline and patience would turn me into a firm, almost impenetrable, almost empty lump of body. So here you see the link between submission and becoming a thing. So this fantasy of becoming a lump drives identification with things. So Walser's sketch, Ash, Needle, Pencil, Match, for example, is a song of praise to the most ordinary and overlooked objects. Needle and pencil are noted briefly in terms of their shared quality of sharpness. One can prick oneself with a needle, while a pencil can be used to take digs at others. But the writer is especially drawn to the featureless and passivity of ash, inconspicuous, inconsequential, weightless, and colorless. It allows itself to be trodden on, pushed around, swept away. You see here, ash is modesty, insignificance, and worthlessness personified. Best of all, it's full of the conviction that it's good for nothing. Can it be more unstable, weaker, more wretched than ash? Not very easily. Is there anything more yielding and tolerant? Not likely. Ash has no character. Where there's ash, there's really nothing at all. Put your foot in ash and you hardly feel that you've stepped in anything. And then there is the melancholic fate of a match, a sturdy and reliable foot soldier lying patiently in a box with its fellows, proper and well behaved. It awaits the time when its head scraped brutally across a rough surface, it flares up and is incinerated. And there's the quote on the right. The moment the little match takes pleasure in its destiny, it dies. The moment it unfolds its meaning, it perishes. The fulfilling of its destiny depends on its self-immolation. In the scaled-down world of Walser's sketches, pathos-written dramas of submission and self-sacrifice are found in the most ordinary things. And in another remarkable essay, Walser reflects on Cézanne's concern for objects, how he commands a tablecloth come to life. Pondering his paintings of flowers, Walser reflects on how things resist understanding and the secrets that dwell in such resistance. Meanwhile, Cézanne's gaze smudges the link between humans and others. He painted his wife as if she were a fruit on a tablecloth, Walser writes. A pat of butter was just as significant as a delicate pleat corrugating his wife's dress. As humans become less human, so things are enchanted. Walser mulls over the soul of a tablecloth, speaks of the essence of things in Cézanne's art, and there's that second quote. The things he contemplated became eloquent. The things to which he gave shape looked back at him as if they had been pleased, and that is how they look to us still. The Swiss writer and the French painter are connected by this solicitude for everyday objects. Now, Cézanne's art, says Walser, is an art of the outline. And I think this is also true of Walser's writing, which shows no interest in filling things out, in precise renderings of size, shape, texture, color. We gain little sense, I think, from his stories of the solidity, material presence of things. They're portrayed as ideal as much as real. Even as the sacred is absent, things are ensouled and animated. His writings are studied with what we might call spirit objects, things that mirror back to him his own sensibility, his distaste for the pretentious and pompous, the sophisticated and self-important. So in the speech to a button, for example, Walser lauds its innocence, its modesty and faithfulness, its desire not to put on airs and make a big deal of itself. You're able to live without anyone knowing in the slightest you even exist. You are happy because modesty is its own reward and faithfulness is at home with itself. Animated objects here possess none of the kind of uncanniness that was attributed to them by Freud, heimlich rather than unheimlich. They echo the writer's own affinity with the unassuming, smiling back at him with gentle approval. So in Walser, we find not only estrangement, a disorienting of perception, but also a delight in discovering, protecting, and attending to things. And I'm just going to wrap up now. I'm almost just got maybe 6 more minutes and I'll be done. So I come to this final question. It's a kind of a question, a style of being, whether that might be a helpful phrase. Let me kind of wrap up what I've said then. Walser turns his face away from politics and is indifferent to what we call society. His sketches and stories often fall into groups or genres, portraits of persons or things, rural or small town landscapes, whimsical anecdotes, reflections on his own life and writing. This scale was largely dictated by his attempt to carve out a living as a journalist. He would send short pieces, often without success, to local newspapers. Yet even in text where the city provides a backdrop, for example, Jakob von Gunten, where we see the hero drifting through the streets of Berlin, we gain very little sense of the modernity of the metropolis. The maelstrom of traffic, bustling crowds, chic department stores, workers streaming to factories or offices. So there's, in that sense, he really does avoid the modern cityscape. Meanwhile, Walser thumbs his nose at politics. In a deadpan essay on Bismarck, for example, we're told that Bismarck wore wide-brimmed hats, waged wars, didn't always frown, and was a most accommodating husband. And a number of critics in this sense have likened Walser's work to a petit bourgeois sensibility because of this supposed avoidance of politics and a certain conservatism. Thanks to a theory of history that assigns an essential spirit to social classes, in this case, backwardness of the lower middle class, something I mentioned a little bit last time. Yet it seems to me that to deploy such language is to leave unacknowledged, in the way I used acknowledgement in my first lecture, Walser's aesthetic provocation to the view that history is moving forward and that the new is therefore the good, because his writing is soaked through with deliberate and provocative anachronism. There's the old-fashioned epithets and adjectives: pious, valiant, gallant, frugal, brave, the creation of archetypal characters, a mimicry of fairy tales, talking animals. He has giants and princesses. He has stories lifted out of space and time. And as we see, he presents us with an animistic world in which objects are lively and things are ensouled. Walser does not so much deconstruct as nonchalantly stroll around the subject-object mind-matter schemes that are often held to define modern thought. To go back then to my experiential concept for this lecture, then I have to kind of ask the question: well, what then does Walser's writing disclose? Well, by Heidegger, of course, disclosure is linked to a certain notion of truth, not truth in the sense of representation or proposition that's accordance with the facts, but aletheia, a kind of unconcealment or making manifest of truth. But in writing about Walser, I find that such a Heideggerian language fragments and crumbles to ashes in the mouth. It seems so ill-suited to his blend of modesty and mockery, his distaste for portentous words and grand ideas. Another philosophically inflected theme, that art discloses a world, feels no more adequate. One can certainly describe, Tolstoy or Tolkien as revealing worlds. I'm not rejecting that way of thinking. But this language of world radiates a wholeness, a coherence, a solidity that seems ill-suited to Walser's writing. Its equivocations and evasions, its flickering play of light and shadow, the shimmer and the haze. And finally, I've suggested that Walser's passionate concern with a humble, ordinary, and familiar will be missed if we frame his work purely as a disclosure of otherness. So what his texts disclose, perhaps, and I say this, tentatively, is a style of being. And I'm drawn to this phrase perhaps because it directs our attention to cadence and tone, disposition and attitude, patterns of action and forms of conduct. Giving way, acquiescence, self-restraint, renunciation, Stephen Connor remarks that these words don't denote an absence of action, but a certain shaping and sculpting of action. As such, style of being seems like a phrase applicable to both Walser's writing and his life. A phrase glints and glitters at the end of Walser's essay on Bismarck. I believe my best lines to be those that cause the reader to believe himself superior to the author. So the desire to be lowly, we realize, perhaps it should be obvious, but it's not at all obvious, I don't think. It's not just a literary motif. It also drives Walser's relation to the reader and his stylistic choices. He's aspiring to write in a way to be looked down on and condescended to. Now, in describing those lines at his best, to be sure, he's carving out a distance from such judgment. Even while bowing his head, a smirk plays undetected on his face. Yet the bow is no less decisive than the smirk. The posture of submission, I think, is qualified, but not thereby neutralized. To say, as one critic does, that Walser caricatures submissiveness to authority, I think is not quite right. The naivete may be cultivated, but it's not a put on. And here he links up to a cohort of writers and artists who prefer wide-eyed wonder to wisdom, who are drawn to the figure of the blockhead and a simpleton, a posture of ducking down and doffing one's cap, a genial wandering without aim or purpose, an unapologetic affirmation of things as they are. These are the qualities that add up to Walser's style of being. So as I say, coming back to Walser now almost 4 decades later, it turns out my response to Walser is not so very different to what it was decades ago. Actually, I ended up pretty much thinking the same things, but perhaps I now feel a little more equipped to sustain my thoughts against objections. Rather than contextualizing Walser's work, I used to say slotting it into existing frames of reference, we can allow it to recontextualize us, to attune us to other forms of existence. A work of art, the philosopher Gianni Vattimo remarks, doesn't only bear witness to past events, it also throws another light upon the present. Why might one long to be small? What are the pleasures of compliance? Why the refusal to judge while also longing to be judged by others? What lies behind the impulse to find everything agreeable? To ally oneself with the nice and the homely against the sophisticated. Is Walser's work to be framed and explained as the literary creation of a Swiss provincial? Or does it rather provincialize the tenets of modern art and thought through its stubborn attachment to another style of being? Thank you. I'll finish there. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Rita. Another wonderful, thought-provoking lecture. So much to deal with. If people want to ask questions, as I say, the Q&A box is down there on the right-hand side. Nobody's arrived yet, so.
I'm so glad we didn't get any kind of technological
absolutely
mishap.
sorry. I should have said what a blessed reprieve that was.
Right.
Well, of the many things that struck me, one of them was your comment about the gentleness with which he's read and received now. I think you said the negative judgments are pretty much unheard of. Right. So is this a kind of collective reparation for the relative neglect and injury he suffered during his working life?
I like that word reparation. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it quite those terms, but I think that's exactly right. And, as I say, he does have this very extremely tragic life and, spent 30 years in mental institutions. He was diagnosed, I think, as schizophrenic at one point. And he was at a couple of different mental institutions and had this, in some ways, very, very pathos-driven life. And I think, as I say, this is a case where anyone who's written anything on Walser is very conscious of the life. And so I think given all that, I'm sure my sense at least is that that would be the reason why everyone is so incredibly kind to him. And I'm obviously I'm not trying to disagree with that kindness. But I have noticed it because, and one thing that's striking now, as I say, Johannes Schmidt talks about the waves of Walser reception. And so there's more and more stuff coming out, so at one point there were just a few things. And now it seems like, endless stories and sketches are being brought out. Sometimes the very same stories are being repackaged in new forms. And so there's now kind of flood of material, and as someone who sort of felt, I needed to at least look at least superficially at that material, there are a number of things that I've looked at where I have been incredibly disappointed, and I have found myself really not being able to say anything about this particular work, that it does seem, as I say, very kind of Heimaty and in a kind of kitschy way. And of course, one can always redeem that by saying that it's irony, or one can try and redeem it in those terms. But nevertheless, I do think that there are some works, Jakob von Gunten especially, I think it's one of the most, important, to me at least, one of the most striking works of the 20th century. But there are certainly some of the short stories and so on I've been, less enamored of personally. Of course, it may be the case that I'm missing something, but inevitably, I would say in any writer's work, there are going to be some texts that are more compelling and some less so. But it does seem noticeable that at least I haven't come across any really kind of negative comments. Of course, I haven't read everything written on Walser, so there may be some critical comments. But I think there's just people feel so protective of him and of this painful, life of isolation and exclusion and lack of literary attention, that it becomes very difficult to say anything negative, I think.
Thank you. So here's a question from Angela Layton. Angela asks as follows: is art then, by its very nature, a constant, unaccommodating refusal of theory/philosophy? In which case, here is my provocation: why should we need to bring them together at all? Or is it that the space between them is in fact the place of fruitful, not exactly thought, but thinking, such as you've given us in these lectures?
Well, that's a big question. Thank you, Angela. Not sure I can answer it fully. So I guess I'm curious from your question, whether you think I'm bringing them together, or whether you think I don't. I guess in the last part of the question would seem to suggest that you think I'm perhaps not bringing them together, or that I'm doing this other kind of thing. I mean, I guess I do see myself as bringing them together, and so I think there is a rationale. I tried to present in my first lecture a rationale for bringing them together, and that rationale would be that in fact philosophy and theory is part of our world, it's part of our mental universe, and it's also part of the universe in which artworks exist. So I would not want to say that the artwork should be seen. So I guess I would not want to, I don't think I would agree with the claim that art is an unaccommodating refusal of theory and philosophy. I mean, there's certainly been arguments that do place art and philosophy in opposition. I mean, my colleague Mark Edmondson wrote a book along these lines, and there's certainly been quite a few, arguments made along those lines, sometimes by people who support theory and sometimes by the people who support the art. I'm not persuaded by that view. I mean, I think there are quite a few works of art, works of literature, for example, that are explicitly philosophical. I mean, it'd be hard to talk about George Eliot, I think, or Thomas Mann without bringing questions of philosophy, because their works are in fact deeply philosophical. But even if they're not deeply philosophical, if you're talking about a poem, or if you're talking about, Walser, who seems to refuse a certain kind of conceptual vocabulary, it does seem nevertheless that works of art can be illuminated, to go back to my language of illumination, by certain philosophical concepts. I mean, the question is going to be which concepts. And so the wager of these lectures, at least, is that I can, bring philosophical concepts together with works of literature without subordinating the literature to the theoretical concept. And I don't know whether that's worked or not. Maybe it hasn't. So for example, disclosure is a philosophical concept, right? But what I've been suggesting is that disclosure can actually tell us something about the way in which art works, about how it affects us, about it's. I think disclosure can actually tell us about the distinctively aesthetic things that art does. Similarly, resonance, which we're talking about next time, is a term that can be applied to a whole range of things. Rosa applies it to, interpersonal relations and attitude to nature and a whole range of other things. But I think resonance is also a helpful word for thinking about the distinctively aesthetic, the qualities that artworks have and why artworks touch us. So I guess since I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, and I'm trying to bring literature and theoretical concepts together, partly because I don't think they can ever be completely separated, because philosophical ideas in the broadest sense, obviously not necessarily a knowledge of Kant or something, but philosophical ideas broadly are part of the world we all breathe, writers and artists as well as readers. And so in that sense, it seems important on the first hand. On the second hand, because certain works are themselves explicitly theoretical or philosophical, especially nowadays, actually, with a lot of contemporary novels, for example, draw on literary theory. And then thirdly, because even if a work is not explicitly philosophical, I do think certain philosophical concepts, obviously not all of them, can actually shed light on the distinctiveness of aesthetic experience. That's my gamble, at least.
Thank you. So we have another question here from an anonymous questioner who asks, do you have any thoughts on whether Walser's style of being could help us grapple with questions about how to be a human in the Anthropocene?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. Well, I guess, in a certain sense, I guess it's like, the reason a lot of people are so fascinated by Bartleby and indeed are fascinated by someone like Walser is precisely, flipping things around. On the one hand, you can say, yes, isn't this awful? Here's this guy just wants to submit and, be subordinate and so on. And from a certain kind of rationalist perspective, as I was suggesting, that provides certain difficulties. But conversely, there is a way in which the humility, the refusal of mastery, the desire to be small, that certain aspects of that, would seem to have potential value in terms of trying to come up with a way of being in the world that isn't about dominating and controlling it. So, I think that argument could be made to some degree. As I said, I'm a little bit sort of nervous about looking to Walser specifically for a kind of model of political action. I mean, I think there are other writings that, can do this better. He's an extraordinary writer, but I've been suggesting the writing is so so multidimensional and slippery that it's hard necessarily to draw out of it any kind of model for thinking or model for life. And certainly one might say, and I think probably a lot of people would say, that the very crisis of climate change and how to deal with it is in fact not going to be solved by being humble and small. It's going to actually have to involve major political and institutional interventions of a massive scale. So while in a certain sense, the idea of a kind of shrinking back into being a zero, I think perhaps does have a certain symbolic appeal at the moment, because it seems to offer a refuge from this kind of arrogant, overbearing desire to dominate and control the world. And I think that's a legitimate appeal of it. I also don't think exactly it can give us any kind of model about how to resolve the climate crisis. Although it's not exactly what you're asking. Perhaps it can give us at least some guidance about how to be a different kind of human being, perhaps. Although, of course, as we all know, the extent to which people ever actually take lessons from literature and change their way of being is an open question, I think.
So here's another one from Christina Wilson, who thanks you for your wonderful recovery of Walser. Can you expand a bit, she asks, on the litmus test you mentioned in relation to the critique of Walser and what colors it brings to light in the work/style of being? Maybe that's related to the gap between philosophy and art that Angela mentioned.
I actually can't. I'm not quite sure what this sentence means. What this question means. I guess I can't remember what I said about litmus test. Does anyone remember?
Well, we can ask Christina to. I mean, this is where the limits of this format appear, because Christina would, in real time, be able to clarify.
Right,
But
right. What colours are bring to life in the book?
If Christina wants to write something swiftly now,
okay,
she can, or we could move on to the next question, perhaps come back to this.
Perhaps Christina can just say a little bit more.
Okay. Let's move on to the next one, which is quite a big one, from Anonym. My immediate response to today's lecture is that it seems to me that Walser's work is like a house with a low door. We must stoop to enter, but inside is the not surprisingly oversized world of some other German literature of the small. Jean-Paul's Wutz, Lenz's Suleiken. But somehow we encounter curiously limited objects that must not spring into gross and dramatic life as they do in Gottfried Benn. I am curious, do you ever feel claustrophobic writing about Walser?
I don't actually. That's an interesting comment. You know, in a sense, I tried to reproduce this a little bit. Oh, am I still there?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, okay. Yes. So, okay. I tried to reproduce this a little bit in the, you know, in the visuals by having this quotation from Jakob von Gunten and this like tiny little white box surrounded by darkness, precisely kind of reproduce that sense of claustrophobia. So I think there is a claustrophobic dimension to it. I think that's right. But I find myself actually very drawn to that kind of literature. I'm drawn to writing that's claustrophobic and anxious. You know, I write a bit about this in Hooked. I was very drawn to Ishiguro's Unconsoled, although less so by his other works, precisely because this sense of anxiety and things bearing in that's very kind of Kafkaesque, and that's enormously appealing to me. Whereas I'm much less drawn to works of literature that are like, you know, verbally exuberant and have tons of fireworks and move around through vast domains and, you know, move across slices of history. I have no interest in, like, you know, or I have little taste for, let me put it this way, for the kind of, you know, the scope of the broad historical novel or something. You know, in terms of my temperament, I am drawn to the small scale text that focuses on this sort of sense of anxiety or unease. I mean, I think that is perhaps not so much even aesthetic judgment as so much an affinity in the sense of a taste or attunement, as I talk about in Hooked. But I think that's right. I like that idea of the house with the low door.
So moving on then, another anonymous questioner who asks, could a style that seems cognitively difficult and non-submissive also bring about illuminating disclosure? How do you feel about our discipline's conventions, in inverted commas, about writing for the aim of coherence, a category that sometimes rejects affective, illuminating disclosure?
That's interesting, because if I understand the question, the idea seems to be, should our criticism itself be a form of disclosure, right? Is that what the question's about? So, you know, as you say, that our conventions for writing, that we write in this, you know, sometimes we write to show coherence. Sometimes we write for other reasons. But that it's certainly true, I think, in terms of our critical writing, there's no attention, I think, is paid to the idea of disclosure or what that might mean. I suppose there is some attention now, more than there used to be, to the kind of aesthetic dimensions of academic writing. And of course, we're now getting more, I'll be talking about this next time when I talk about the Dion Brand novel, but we're now getting more kinds of hybrid texts, for example, right, that combine literary elements with critical elements. So even though the idea of disclosure, I think, is not very explicit, I think, in academic discourse, I think there is now more of an attempt to write in a aesthetically moving and affecting style. It's something I'm not very good at. I don't think I'm a clear writer. I'm not thinking it's a particularly aesthetically powerful one. So I'm trying to write in a somewhat more you know, aesthetically moving mode than I'm used to doing. I mean, it's interesting also, Nicholas Comprinis in his book on critique of disclosure, he talks a lot about the illuminating power of disclosure, but I don't think and he talks a bit about literature in that book, but he doesn't take it so much into his own writing. I think his own writing is not very disclosive in that book. It's rather, it's a very academic and challenging kind of discourse. But he's actually, Comprinis has written a wonderful essay in New Literary History, actually, about Elizabeth Costello. And there, I think his own writing moves much more towards literary criticism as a form of disclosure. So I do think, there is some writing that's trying to do this a little bit more. Now, I think some of Toril Moy's writing too, who I mentioned in the first lecture, she actually just wrote to me and said that I need to discuss Sartre and Sartre's notion of disclosure, actually, in what is literature dévoilée, which I actually don't know very much about. But yeah, I think that's an interesting question. To what extent we can engage more with the idea of disclosure in our own academic writing.
Can I throw something perhaps rather obvious in here, Rita? I was struck when you, at one point, you said of Walser, ordinary things dig in their heels. Rather resonant way of putting. Now, if one heard that out of context and wondered what kind of artist you were talking about, I think one might well think of the visual arts, and Cézanne came in, rather beautifully towards the end, but also in literary terms of poetry, or specifically of non-narrative poetry.
Right.
Which does a lot of digging in of its heels in honor of ordinary things. I mean, maybe that's just a too obvious sort of thing to say, but I was very struck by the strangeness of Walser in a very unusual kind of prose, digging in his heels in praise of the ordinary, Lauren.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, it's certainly the whole genre of the still life also. I mean, both in painting and in literature. Actually, Rosemary Lloyd, I don't know if you ever knew her, she used to be at Cambridge, has written a great book on still lives. It's still lives in literature, where she talks about those moments, where the narrative stops. I think she focuses mainly on 19th century, I can't remember now, but, when, and the novelist trains their gaze on a certain object and just looks at it for its own right. Of course, Rowan Barthes was kind of suspicious of this, the barometer, the Flaubertian barometer as being nothing but a reality effect. But I think we could look at the barometer, in fact, as digging in its heels and asserting its right to exist in that way. So yeah, that's nice actually. This kind of goes back to the previous question about the kind of small scale, and that so much of Walser's work is on a small scale. But I say literally in that tiny writing, but then also in these small sketches, perhaps more so than the novels. And one could make an interesting parallel, I think, there, certainly to paintings. And often, when you go to an art gallery, and I don't know if this has happened to you sometimes, you wander into a room and you're drawn to some, like, I don't know, famous canvas that's there in the middle of the room with a bench in front of it you're supposed to look at. And then at a certain moment, there's some like tiny picture, some tiny painting of a bird or something in a corner of the room that's maybe only 6 inches by 6 inches. And then you realize how extraordinary it is. And it's so easy to be looked over because of its very smallness.
Okay, I think we'll make this the last one if that's okay. And we return to Christina Wilson, or she returns to us, writing as follows. Interesting contrast with someone like Virginia Woolf, say, whose short works often focus on the small, everyday objects, which lead her to vast caverns and mazes of interiority. Walser's small things, or focus on the surface, is no less expansive, but it seems to move us outward towards a style of being, the person in a world, as you put it, rather than groping for the consciousness of a mind and a body.
Yeah, no, so that makes perfect sense. I think that seems exactly right. So it would be interesting to do a kind of contrast between these, because of course the interest in ordinary phenomena of everyday life is a recurring theme. I was just reading Gardner's wonderful book on everyday life, or rereading it, that talks about this as a sort of theme in a range of both philosophers and theorists and writers, Perec and a whole range of others. So obviously that's a long-standing concern with a great many writers, but I think the question or comment really, I think, highlights the difference that with Woolf there is such a stress on interiority, and so these everyday objects have this kind of, they also have a kind of illumination, right? I think in a certain sense they have this kind of iridescence to them, but the iridescence seems more closely related to some kind of sense of a mind in tune with that iridescence. Whereas I think with Walser, there's much more the sense of the things there. As I was suggesting, there is a certain affinity between the things and Walser himself. Everyone's modest. The objects are modest. I'm modest. I, the Walser here. The objects are humble. I'm humble. But the the attunement between the writing I in Walser and the objects, it's not about some notion of an expanding consciousness. It's more about a kind of annihilation of consciousness, I think. And that would make a very interesting, I think, contrast to Woolf especially.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there if that's okay with you, Rita. And thank you again most warmly, and our questioners too. And we look forward to welcoming you back for your fourth and last lecture next week on resonance, where you'll be talking about, do you want to just say a word about the two novels?
Sure, yeah. So next week it's going to be, I'm going to be discussing the work of the German social theorist Hartmut Rosa, specifically this idea of resonance, and trying to think about how the idea of resonance might give us a way of actually, my response to Angela, my attempt to perhaps foolhardy or quixotic attempt to bring together literature and theory. I'm going to be arguing that resonance is actually a way of talking about being both enchanted by literature and being enchanted by theory. So, and I'm going to be doing readings of two novels, Stoner by John Williams, about someone who's enchanted with literature, and then a novel called Theory by Dion Brown, which is a very recent novel, 2019, which is about a PhD student who's utterly obsessed and fixated with critical theory. And I'm going to kind of look at them both in relation to each other and see what happens.
Your British readers will be hard pressed to read Theory by next week because it's out of print or out of stock in this.
Yeah, no, I was in touch with well, I'm still not explaining to you already. I hope it'll make sense without, I think it'll make perfect sense without knowing the book. I was actually in touch with an agent to see why that was the case. And apparently it doesn't have a English publisher. Oh. And so it came out, I mean, it won some very prestigious prize in Canada, and was very, some Toronto Literary Prize, I think it was, and seems very highly regarded, but it seems to be not this. So I apologize for this. I didn't know at the time when I was obviously writing about it, and I was just so drawn to this novel. It's just fabulous, really brilliant piece of writing. But at the moment it seems unavailable in England. She did say, if a group of people want it, she could organize it to be shipped over. But I think, perhaps people need to write to Penguin, because Penguin's the publisher, and say, we need to have this available in England. It'll be a perfect novel for graduate, postgraduate seminars. It's all about the travails of being a postgraduate student.
Okay, thank you very much for that then. So we look forward to seeing you again next week, and also our participants. Thank you very much indeed, Rita. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.